The sterile hum of the projector was the only sound in the otherwise silent, empty conference room, presentation still on screen. Fluorescent lights glared off the polished wood of the table, illuminating a half-empty coffee cup and a scattering of crumpled notes. My own reflection stared back from the darkened screen, a pale, tired face framed by thinning hair. Another late night. Another deal that felt more like a surrender than a victory. My fingers traced the condensation ring on the table, a familiar damp circle. The weight of it all pressed down, a constant, dull ache behind my eyes. Bills, expectations, the gnawing fear of never quite measuring up. Raj, they called me. Raj, who was supposed to be something. Right now, I felt like nothing more than a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. Then the solicitor's letter arrived. Thick, cream-colored paper, embossed with a crest I'd never seen. It spoke of a distant relative, a grey-tant thrice removed, whose name was a mere whisper in the family tree. Apparently she'd left me everything. The words themselves felt foreign, too large for my small existence. The inheritance wasn't just money, though the figure mentioned was staggering, enough to erase every worry I'd ever carried. It was also property. A sprawling estate, nestled deep in the countryside, miles from anywhere. The details were vague, almost deliberately so. A place called Blackwood Manor. The name itself held a certain resonance, a dark, earthy sound. My gut instinct screamed caution. This was too good to be true. A life raft tossed into a churning sea just when I thought I was going under. But the alternative was more of this. The endless cycle of striving, of never quite arriving. The promise of Blackwood Manor, of a life unburdened, was a siren song I couldn't ignore. I booked a flight, packed a single-worn suitcase, and left the sterile confines of the city behind. The journey was long, the landscape gradually shifting from manicured suburbs to rolling hills, then to dense, untamed forest. The further I drove, the more the world seemed to shrink, the roads narrowing, the trees closing in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Cell service had vanished hours ago. Watchful. The gates of Blackwood Manor loomed, wrought iron twisted into elaborate, unsettling patterns. They creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo the very earth beneath my feet. Beyond them, the house itself rose from the mist, a hulking silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Ivy, thick and ancient, snaked its way up the walls, blurring the lines between structure and nature, as if the house itself was slowly being consumed by the land. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of dust, decaying wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old blood. My footsteps, unnaturally loud on the flagstone floor of the grand foyer, seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the space. A sweeping staircase, its banister intricately carved with grimacing gargoyles, ascended into the gloom. I found the solicitor's file on a dusty mahogany desk. The will, neatly bound, lay open. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, searching for any hint, any clue as to why this inheritance had fallen to me. The words were precise, legalistic, yet a strange undercurrent ran through them. Phrases like the rightful heir and a legacy of protection stood out, unsettling in their vagueness. There was no mention of the previous occupants, no explanation for the isolation of the estate. Each room felt like a preserved moment, a tableau of a life long gone, yet the air vibrated with a latent energy, a sense of presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. A labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each more dilapidated than the last. It was clear no one had lived here for a very long time, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, or was something else sharing this vast, decaying space with me. The dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, a silent, swirling ballet. I descended from the upper floors, the silence of the mansion pressing in, a physical weight. My footsteps, each one a loud pronouncement on the bare wood, echoed as if the house itself were listening. The will, the wealth, it all felt so distant now, so absurd, compared to the oppressive stillness that clung to the air like cobwebs. I found myself in an empty conference room, presentation still on screen. The projector, miraculously, was still functional, casting a sickly green glow onto the dust-streaked screen. A series of bar graphs, incomprehensible financial projections, and bullet points filled the display. It looked like a relic from a forgotten era, a ghost of commerce frozen in time. I ran a hand over the polished surface of the long, empty table. It was cool, almost slick, despite the visible layer of grime. Who had sat here? What deals had been struck in this sterile space, so out of place in this decaying behemoth? The room smelled of stale paper and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old pennies. I brushed against a stack of files on a side table, sending a cascade of brittle paper to the floor. The rustle seemed unnaturally loud, a sudden, sharp interruption of the quiet. I knelt to gather them, my fingers tracing the faded ink of their labels. They were all financial reports, old ledgers, and dense legal documents. Nothing that shed any light on the eccentric relative who had left me this place or the fortune he'd promised. I stood up, turning my attention back to the screen. The presentation was on a loop, the slides advancing with a soft click. The last slide showed a company logo, an abstract interlocking design that made my eyes ache. As I watched, the image flickered, just a brief stutter like a faulty bulb. I blinked, assuming it was my tired eyes, but then it happened again. My breath hitched. It was just the projector, I told myself, old technology prone to glitches. Still, my gaze lingered on the screen, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I could hear the faint hum of the projector, a low thrum that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. Outside, the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that seemed to weave its way through the very foundations of the house. I decided to leave the conference room. The air in there had grown heavy, suffocating. As I stepped out into the hallway, the door swung shut behind me with a soft thud, the latch clicking into place. I froze. I was sure I hadn't closed it that firmly. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling slightly. It wouldn't budge. Locked. I jiggled it, then pushed against the solid wood with my shoulder. Nothing. It was as if the door had become a solid part of the wall. A wave of heat washed over me, prickling my skin. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the impassive wooden surface. The portraits on the walls, their painted eyes following my every move, seemed to sneer. I could feel the house watching me, a vast, indifferent intelligence that had just made its first subtle move. Was this just my imagination, fueled by the isolation and the sheer strangeness of this inheritance? Or had the house, in some unfathomable way, decided I was its prisoner? The air in the empty conference room, presentation still on screen, tasted stale. It clung to the back of my throat, a gritty film. I'd wandered in after my exploration of the upper floors, the silence of the mansion, a persistent hum beneath my skin. The projector still hummed too, casting a ghostly glow on the screen. A sterile corporate landscape of pie charts and bar graphs, utterly at odds with the decaying grandeur outside. Who had used this room, and why was it left like this? A snapshot of a life that felt impossibly distant. My flashlight beam swept across the polished table, catching the faint rings left by forgotten coffee cups. The will, the wealth, it all felt so unreal. This place was a mausoleum, a tomb, and I was the sole inhabitant. Except for the things that made the floorboards creak when there was no wind, the whispers that coiled just at the edge of hearing. I remembered Raj, my grandfather, a man I'd only known through faded photographs and hushed family stories. A man of business, they'd said, sharp, driven. The will spoke of his legacy, of a fortune waiting for me. But this mansion, this sprawling, suffocating monument to his life, felt less like an inheritance and more like a trap. I walked out of the conference room, the door sighing shut behind me. My phone, I noticed with a jolt, had no signal, not a single bar. I'd tried it earlier on the main floor and again on the landing. Nothing. It was as if the very air in this place repelled connection. The nearest town, the agent had said, was a good hour's drive. An hour I suddenly felt acutely unable to bridge. My breath hitched. I'd been so focused on the physical decay of the house, the peeling wallpaper, water stains that looked like weeping eyes, that I'd almost dismissed the other things, the feeling of being watched. I decided to head back to the main hall, to the imposing oak door. Maybe I'd missed something. A way to boost the signal, a hidden antenna, some absurd, old-fashioned contraption. Anything. The house seemed to stretch as I walked, the distances greater than they had been minutes before. Each step was deliberate, my senses on high alert. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a symphony of protest. I stopped, straining to hear over the thumping in my chest. There was that a scuff, a drag. My flashlight beam, usually a steady beacon, flickered. Just a loose bulb, I told myself, old wiring. I reached the main hall, the grand staircase looming. It felt pregnant with unspoken things. I'd barely glanced at it before, too preoccupied with the sheer scale of the place. Now I saw my reflection. My face was pale, my eyes wide. A stranger staring back. Then a movement in the mirror behind me. My heart leaped into my throat. I recoiled, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. I whirled around, flashlight beam shaking. The hall was empty, completely, utterly empty. The space behind me was just space, but I had seen it. A flicker, a shape, something tall and gaunt just at the edge of the mirror's frame. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the impression lingered, etched into my mind. A phantom. A trick of the light, my own fear manifesting itself. I forced myself to breathe, to push down the rising panic. I needed to get out. I needed to call someone, anyone, still no signal. It was a dead piece of plastic and glass in this dead house. I looked back at the mirror. My reflection stared back, a little less pale now, but the fear was still there, a raw, exposed nerve. I thought about Raj, my grandfather. Was this what he wanted, to trap me here? A floorboard creaked upstairs, not a settling sound. This was deliberate, a slow, measured tread. Moving towards the stairs, I froze, every muscle tensed. The flashlight beam, steady now, pointed towards the grand staircase. The tread had stopped. Where was it now? The projector's hum was a low thrum against the pervasive silence. It vibrated through the polished floorboards of the empty conference room, presentation still on screen, and settled in my teeth. I traced the condensation on my water glass, the chill seeping into my fingertips. The slides flickered, a silent testament to a meeting that had never happened, or perhaps one that had ended abruptly. What were these charts and graphs meant to convey? Figures, projections, a narrative of growth I couldn't decipher. It felt like a coded message, another layer of this house's inscrutable language. It carried the faint, metallic tang of old dust and something else. Something vaguely organic, like damp earth. My gaze drifted to the screen again. A graph depicting a sharp upward curve caught my eye. A shiver, not entirely from the room's coolness, traced its way down my spine. My initial thought had been to dismiss it all, to pack my bags and flee. But the will, the promise of wealth, it was a tether I couldn't break. And then there was this house itself. It pulsed with a history I felt compelled to unearth. I was a writer, after all. Mysteries were my bread and butter. Except this wasn't a story I was crafting. It was my reality, and the ink was far too real. I stood, the scrape of my chair echoing unnervingly loud. I walked closer to the screen, my reflection a pale ghost superimposed over the projected data. The numbers blurred. What was I looking for? A clue? A hidden meaning? My fingers itched to touch the cool, smooth surface of the screen, to interact with this phantom meeting. A faint click from somewhere in the room made me jump. My head snapped up. Nothing, just the silent rows of empty chairs, their plush fabric absorbing all light, all sound. My heart, which I'd been trying to keep steady, gave an involuntary lurch. It was just the house settling, I told myself. Old houses made noises, but this felt different. It felt observed. I turned my attention back to the presentation. One slide showed a series of interlocking gears. Complex, intricate, they spun in perfect mechanical harmony. But as I stared, the image seemed to waver, the gears appearing to grind, to snag. A low, guttural sound, like metal groaning under immense pressure, seemed to emanate from the projector itself. I blinked, and the gears were smooth again, their digital rotation seamless. Was I imagining it? The strain of isolation, the constant unease, it was starting to play tricks on me. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the clamminess of my scalp. I needed to get out of this room, out of this suffocating quiet. But my feet felt rooted to the spot. The presentation had become a focal point, a puzzle box I was desperate to unlock. The sheer wealth promised in the will suddenly felt like a flimsy lure, a distraction from whatever truth lay buried within these walls. My eyes scanned the room again, more deliberately this time. The walls were a muted gray, punctuated by framed, abstract art that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. The carpet underfoot was thick, a deep pile that muffled my footsteps, making me feel like I was walking through water. I noticed a small, discreet door tucked away in the far corner, almost camouflaged against the paneling. A utility closet or something more. A sudden gust of wind rattled the tall, arched windows, even though I'd checked them earlier. They were sealed tight. Sound was like skeletal fingers scratching against the glass. My breath hitched. I moved towards the hidden door, my hand outstretched. It was smooth, almost unnaturally so, devoid of any grain or texture. It was too soft to discern words, but the intent was clear. A warning, a welcome. The handle turned with a soft click, far less jarring than the earlier sound. The door swung inward, revealing not a closet, but a narrow, descending staircase. It beckoned, promising answers. Or perhaps a final, irreversible descent. The slides flickered, a digital ghost of the meeting I'd been forced to attend earlier that day. A meeting that had felt less like a business transaction and more like a ritualistic unveiling. The solicitor, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with a kind of weary resignation, had laid out the terms. Not just the inheritance, the vast, incomprehensible wealth that was supposed to be mine, but the stipulations. The years I had to live within the mansion's walls, the absolute isolation, and then the projector. He'd insisted on the presentation. A history of the house, he'd called it, a necessary preamble, but it felt like a warning. The grainy images of the mansion's construction, the names of its former inhabitants, the unsettlingly frequent mention of disappearances and accidents. It all coalesced into a knot of unease in my stomach. The presentation was still active. A loop of architectural diagrams and faded photographs. I'd tried to shut it off, but the controls were dead. The laptop, a sleek, modern machine, was as unresponsive as the mansion's ancient locks. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. I stood, the movement jarring in the stillness. The air here was different from the rest of the house, thinner. It carried a faint, metallic tang like old blood. I'd smelled it before in the deepest parts of the cellar, but here, it was subtle, insidious. I walked towards the projector, a hulking black box casting a distorted rectangle of light onto the opposite wall. The images shifted again, a family portrait this time. Stern faces, impossibly old-fashioned clothing. Their eyes, even in the faded monochrome, seemed to bore into me. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. Not just watched, but assessed. A low creak echoed from somewhere above, the house settling. I told myself, my voice a dry whisper in the vastness, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It was the sound of something immense shifting its weight. I remembered the solicitor's words, his carefully chosen phrases about the mansion's unique character and long memory. He hadn't been talking about leaky pipes or drafty windows. My gaze drifted back to the screen. The family portrait dissolved, replaced by a single, stark architectural drawing, a floor plan. It looked familiar, yet subtly wrong. Lines shifted, rooms rearranged themselves in my peripheral vision. I blinked and the image stabilized. It was the mansion's layout, but not as I knew it. There were passages I'd never found, rooms that seemed to exist only on paper. My heart, which I'd been trying to keep steady, began to thump against my ribs, a dull, insistent rhythm. I took a step back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug. The glass of water tipped, spilling onto the polished floor with a sharp crack. Then a sound, not a creak, not a hum. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. It seemed to coil around me, a silken thread of sound that prickled my skin. It wasn't a human voice. It was something older, something vast and elemental. It spoke my name. Raj. The sound was everywhere and nowhere. It vibrated in the air, in the floor, in my very bones. The room was empty, utterly, terrifyingly empty. Hours. My breath hitched. The metallic tang in the air intensified, thick and cloying. The floorboards beneath me seemed to groan, a deep, resonant sound that mirrored the tremor running through my own body. I felt a pressure building, an invisible weight pressing down, squeezing the air from my lungs. I stumbled back, my hand reaching for the door, my fingers fumbling for the handle. The metal burned my skin. I yanked, but it wouldn't budge. Locked from the outside. The presentation screen flickered one last time, displaying not a diagram, but a single terrifying word scrawled in what looked like dried blood. Mine. Only the spilled water on the floor, catching the faint moonlight from the high windows, offered any illumination. And in that dim, reflected glow, I saw it. A faint, shimmering outline on the wall opposite the projector. Was this what the solicitor had intended? Was this the true inheritance? The screen pulsed. That sickly yellow light, the one that had been so innocently benign just moments ago, now seemed to leach the color from my face. The metallic smell, so sharp, so insistent, filled my nostrils, making me gag. It wasn't just the smell anymore. It was a taste, coppery and foul, coating the back of my tongue. I pressed a hand to my mouth, the rough wool of my sweater scratching against my skin. The floorboards were singing a low, mournful tune beneath my feet, a counterpoint to the frantic, uneven thrumming in my chest. A tremor, deep and visceral, shook my bones. I felt watched, intensely watched. The images on the screen were no longer charts or graphs. They were fractured, distorted glimpses of things I'd tried to bury. The gaping maw of the sinkhole that swallowed my childhood bicycle, the splintered wood of my father's workshop after the fire, the vacant stare of the woman I'd failed to save at the accident scene. Each one flashed for a heart-stopping second, sharp and agonizingly real, before dissolving into the swirling chaos. The house was using the presentation, using my own memories against me. It knew, how could it know? I stumbled back, my heel catching on a loose floorboard. The sound, a sharp crack, seemed to echo endlessly in the vast, empty conference room, presentation still on screen. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise, a tangible weight pressing in on me. The air grew colder, a biting chill that sank into my bones, far beyond the usual draftiness of this old place. My breath plumed in front of me, a ghostly white wisp in the dim light. I could feel it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere like the moment before a storm breaks, but there was no storm outside. My mind raced, trying to latch onto a plan, any plan. I had to get out. Now, the cryptic will, the promise of wealth, it was all a lie, a trap. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers numb and clumsy. No signal, of course. I'd tried it a dozen times before, always the same dead zone. But maybe, just maybe, if I got closer to the windows. I moved towards the tall, arched windows that overlooked the overgrown gardens. The glass was thick, etched with years of grime and condensation, distorting the view into a murky, impressionistic smear. I squinted, trying to make out shapes, anything familiar. Skeletal branches of the ancient oak trees clawed at the sky, their forms twisted and menacing. It slithered around the corners of the house, seeping through the cracks, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something sickly sweet like decaying flowers. As I reached the nearest window, I saw my reflection staring back at me, gaunt, wide-eyed, a stranger, and behind me in the distorted glass a flicker, a movement. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing, just the rows of empty chairs, the polished table, the still glowing screen, but the feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It was closer now, much closer. I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the room. They writhed in the periphery of my vision, just beyond the reach of the screen's sickly glow. I could hear it now, a faint scuttling sound, like tiny claws on wood, coming from the ceiling. It was so subtle, so easily dismissed as the house settling, as vermin. My gaze fell on the presentation remote, lying innocently on the table. A fool's hope, I knew, but I had to try something, anything. I snatched it up, my hand trembling. I clicked the button. I clicked it again, harder, still nothing. The screen remained locked on its terrifying loop, the images of my deepest fears flashing and fading, marking me. The scuttling sound from above grew louder, more insistent. It was moving, creeping its way across the ceiling, directly above me. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a faint tremor that mirrored the frantic pounding of my own heart. The metallic tang in the air was overwhelming now, thick enough to choke on. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it all out, but the images were seared behind my eyelids, vivid and damning. I opened my eyes, a desperate resolve hardening within me. I wouldn't be a prisoner. I wouldn't be prey. It was only a few yards away. I could reach it. I had to reach it. But as I took that first step, the floorboards beneath my feet gave a sudden, violent lurch. Not a creak, not a groan, but a sickening heave, as if the house itself had drawn a breath and exhaled. I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the table. The remote clattered to the floor. From the corner of my eye, I saw it. It had a form, indistinct but undeniably present, and it was moving with a terrifying speed. It flowed across the floor, silent and inexorable, closing the distance between us. My breath hitched. I felt a hunger, not my own, but something ancient and vast, emanating from the heart of the house, and it was directed solely at me. Was this it? Was this how it ended? The air in the empty conference room, presentation still on screen, was thick with a silence that pressed in on my eardrums. Fluorescent lights hummed with a sickly yellow glow, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed like trapped things. The screen itself, a vast, blank canvas of projected data, seemed to watch me, its passive presence more unnerving than any active threat. Rows of empty chairs faced it, a silent, expectant audience. I remembered this room. I remembered the sterile scent of stale coffee and nervous energy. Now it smelled of dust and something else, something metallic, like old pennies left to rust. I'd found my way here by accident, or perhaps I was guided. The house, it didn't just contain things, it influenced them. My thoughts, my steps, even the dust motes dancing in the artificial light seemed to bend to its will. I'd been trying to retrace my steps from the library, seeking a forgotten journal, when the hallway had simply shifted. The familiar tapestry of faded hunting scenes had dissolved, replaced by this stark, modern space. A stark, modern space that felt utterly wrong, utterly alien, despite its banality. The presentation on the screen was a ghost of a past life. Charts and graphs, bullet points detailing market projections and quarterly reports. It was the kind of sterile, meaningless information that used to fill my days before I inherited this mausoleum. I walked closer, my footsteps unnervingly loud on the polished linoleum. The projector's fan word, a low, insistent drone that seemed to vibrate in my bones. A specific slide caught my eye, a pie chart, stark and unforgiving, showing a division of assets. My name was listed, alongside a percentage that made my breath hitch. It was more than I'd ever dreamed of, more than the cryptic will had hinted at, but the numbers felt tainted, like they were printed on parchment made from flayed skin. I reached out, my fingers hovering inches from the screen. The image shimmered, not from the projector, but from within. The numbers themselves seemed to writhe, forming grotesque faces that leered and mocked me. Yours, but never truly yours. My hands flew up, shielding my face. The metallic tang in the air intensified, sharp and coppery. My skin prickled, 1,000 tiny needles pricking my flesh. I stumbled back, my heel catching on an unseen edge. I fell hard, the impact jarring my teeth. The room swam. When my vision cleared, green was normal again. The pie chart was just a pie chart. They lingered, a chorus of sibilant voices weaving a tapestry of doubt and fear around me. They spoke of my own insecurities, my deepest failings, magnified and twisted into monstrous forms. They reminded me of every mistake I'd ever made, every opportunity I'd let slip through my fingers. You are not worthy, they hissed. This wealth is a trap, this house, it owns you. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. But where would I run? The hallways outside had already proven to be unreliable. I forced myself to look at the screen again, but this time I saw something else. A single red-inked annotation scrawled across the bottom of the pie chart. It wasn't part of the original presentation. It was new. It read, "The foundation. The foundation." The house was built on something old. Something that was now actively feeding on my anxieties, on my greed. The empty conference room, presentation still on screen, was no longer just a bizarre manifestation. It was a warning, a testament to the house's insidious power to manipulate reality, to twist the familiar into the terrifying. I had to find the foundation. I had to understand what lay beneath this opulent decay. When they sputtered back to life, the presentation was gone. The screen was blank. They were closer now, right at the edge of my hearing, promising to show me what truly lay at the heart of the house. What was it that the foundation held? The words on the screen swam. The foundation. It was more than just a structural detail, wasn't it? The house wasn't just built on something, it was part of it. I felt a prickle at the base of my skull, a familiar sensation that always preceded the house's more insistent intrusions. My gaze snapped back to the projector, to the grainy photograph of the estate's original blueprints. There, beneath the sprawling manor, a dark, irregular shape was sketched, labeled simply substructure. It wasn't a basement. It was something else entirely. Something the architects had deemed important enough to note, yet too disturbing to elaborate on. My breath hitched. The air in the empty conference room, presentation still on screen, grew heavy, thick with a cloying, damp scent like turned earth and forgotten things. I'd noticed it before, a subtle perfume of decay that clung to the air in certain rooms, but now it was overpowering. It filled my lungs, making each inhale a struggle. My palms slicked with sweat. I wanted to turn off the projector, to erase the damning evidence, but my fingers felt leaden, useless. The house had been a parasite, feeding on my hope, my desperation for the promised fortune. Now I knew why. It was anchored to something ancient, something that craved the same things I did: sustenance, growth, dominion, and I, Raj, had willingly walked into its maw. The wealth was a lure, a bait on a hook sunk deep into my ambition. A low hum vibrated through the floor, a resonant thrum that seeped into my bones. It wasn't the house settling, this was deliberate, a guttural sound from the earth itself. The lights flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced with a life of their own across the projection. The image of the blueprints wavered, the substructure seeming to pulse, to expand. I could feel it, a vast, hungry presence stirring beneath my feet, reaching out. I backed away from the screen, my eyes darting around the sterile, impersonal room. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a neutral space, but the house's influence was pervasive. It had seeped into the very fabric of this place, twisting its mundane reality into something else. The hum intensified, morphing into a low groan that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. A memory surfaced, unbidden, the dusty, leather-bound journal I'd found in the library, its pages filled with the spidery script of the original architect. He'd written of offerings, of appeasement, of a debt owed to the deep. I'd dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman, but now it felt like a prophecy. The wealth wasn't a reward, it was a payment. A payment for what? For the house's continued existence, for my own. The groan deepened, a sound of immense pressure building, of something ancient straining against its bonds. The air crackled with an unseen energy. It was drawing me in, its fear and doubt wrapping around my resolve, not just of this room but of the house. It was a map, a key, a trap. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But it wasn't just fear. I wouldn't be consumed. I wouldn't be another offering. I remembered a passage from the journal, a desperate plea for understanding, a desperate attempt to name the unnamed entity. Then a soft, scraping sound, like fingernails on stone, began to echo from directly beneath the floor. It was closer now, much closer. I fumbled for my phone, its weak beam cutting a trembling swath through the black. The projection was gone, but the scraping continued, a rhythmic, insistent sound that promised an imminent breach. It was coming from the foundation. It was coming for me. The scraping stopped. It was a mercy in a way. The silence that rushed in was a vast, suffocating thing, heavier than any noise. I could feel the grit of the floor beneath my cheek, a cold, damp sensation that seeped through my shirt. My phone, a useless slab of glass and metal, lay somewhere beyond my outstretched fingers. I didn't dare move. Every instinct screamed at me to freeze, to become part of the dusty floorboards. Cease to exist. The presentation on the screen, a garish slideshow of projected profits and market growth, flickered back to life, casting a sickly green glow over the empty conference room. It was marking me, I thought. A testament to the life I'd left behind, the world that no longer seemed to exist. My breath hitched. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and something else, something metallic like old blood. My own blood, perhaps, I couldn't tell. My ears were ringing. A high-pitched whine that threatened to drown out my own thoughts. I finally forced myself to move, a slow, agonizing crawl backward until my spine met the cool, unforgiving metal of a chair leg. The scraping had been under the floor, directly under us. I remembered the architect's cryptic, almost gleeful description of the manor's sub-basement, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers designed for, well, he'd never finished the sentence. But I knew now, it wasn't for storage. Wasn't for wine, it was for them, Raj, my name. The Raj who had been seduced by promises of wealth, the Raj who had scoffed at warnings, the Raj who had walked into this house with a swagger. That Raj was gone, I had to get out. The thought was a tiny ember in the ashes of my resolve, but where? The doors were sealed. The windows I now knew were illusions. Every exit was a trap. The house had played its game. It had shown me what it could do, what it could make me see. It had fed on my anxieties, magnified them, twisted them into tangible horrors, and it had almost succeeded. But then something shifted. A defiance, small and fragile, began to bloom within me. It wasn't courage, not yet. It was a stubborn refusal to be consumed. I wouldn't give it the satisfaction. I wouldn't become another ghost haunting its decaying halls. I pushed myself to my feet, my limbs stiff and trembling. The presentation continued its silent, robotic march through the corporate jargon. I reached out and touched the cool glass. The images swam before my eyes, the numbers and charts blurring into an abstract mess. I closed my eyes, focusing on the feeling of the glass under my fingertips. Solid, real, an anchor. When I opened them again, I saw it. A small, almost imperceptible flicker in the corner of the screen, an anomaly in the otherwise perfect digital display. It wasn't part of the presentation. It was a glitch, a weakness. A desperate plan began to form, a desperate gamble. The house was a system, a complex, insidious mechanism, and every mechanism, no matter how sophisticated, had a flaw. I just had to find it. I had to exploit it. I spent the next few hours, or perhaps it was days, I lost all track of time, in a state of hypervigilance. I was looking for the seams, the places where the illusion frayed. I found them. A loose floorboard in the library that revealed not a hidden passage, but a simple, dusty crawl space. A section of wallpaper in the west wing that peeled back to expose solid, unadorned plaster. Tiny imperfections, easily overlooked by someone who wasn't looking for them. But I was looking. The house seemed to sense my change. I felt its anger, its frustration. It was used to easy prey. It was not used to being studied, dissected. The presentation screen in the conference room remained my focal point. I returned to it repeatedly, observing its every flicker and pulse. The glitch I'd seen before, it reappeared, a tiny, insistent stutter in the flow of data. It was like a nerve ending, a point of vulnerability. I remembered the architect's final, rambling words, spoken as he handed me the keys. He'd mentioned something about the heart of the machine, a failsafe he'd installed, a way to reset the balance. I dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. Now I knew he'd been telling me the truth. I had to find this heart. It had to be connected to the presentation, to the screen. It had to be the source of the house's power, its consciousness. My focus narrowed to a single point. I wouldn't let it win. I wouldn't let it consume me. I would find its heart and I would break it. But as I stood there, bathed in the unholy green light of the screen, a new sound began to emerge. It was a low thrumming, deep within the walls, a resonant vibration that seemed to shake me to my very bones. It wasn't the scraping anymore. It was something far more powerful. It was the sound of the house waking up.